So thank you all. Welcome. I'm Gracie Branch. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning at NAESP. We so appreciate your patience today. I know that you've all been there. You're ready to go. Everything is set. And then you lose internet access or have another tech problem. So hopefully we'll get that resolved shortly. But I want to go ahead and introduce our great presenters today. We have Jess Searles. Jess is a technical assistance coach for the Lead for Literacy Center at the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon. She has over 13 years of experience in delivering classroom instruction, collaborating with educators, and leadership to support program implementation, and designing professional development on literacy and educational practices. And assisting Jess today, and our co-presenter, who's the one who's been unfortunately having our tech issues, is Dr. Lauren Artsey. She is a technical assistant coach for the Lead for Literacy Center and a senior researcher at American Institute for Research. So I'm going to hand it over to Jess to begin.
Thank you, Gracie, and thank you, Honor, too, for hosting our webinar series with NAESP. We've really enjoyed our collaboration with you. So I am Jess, and I see Lauren is maybe having some luck getting on, so we'll hopefully she'll be able to join in too in just a few minutes. But just a quick note that the L4L Center is a collaboration between the University of Oregon, the Center on Teaching and Learning, and AIR, the American Institutes for Research. And we are funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and we're a collaboration of quite a few different centers. So right now we're collaborating for this web series with NAESP, but we also do some work with WETA, a broadcasting station out of the Virginia area, and then the Meadows Center also does some collaboration work with us as well. So looking at the Lead for Literacy web event series, this is quite a ways down in the series. We've had a really good series running and a lot of fun with NAESP over the past few months. We're now on April 1st, April Fool's Day, glad you're here, looking at meaning level skills. And then our last one in this series for this year is June 3rd on professional development structure. So we hope you can join us for that session. Session objectives for this particular session is looking at the critical components of meaning-based instruction and evidence-based practices to promote language comprehension, and also accessing some web-based tools and resources to support implementation of those practices. We'll be focusing on our instruction and intervention elements of our framework, and on the Lead for Literacy website, we do have an L4L framework. Instruction and intervention is one of 5 elements of that framework, and that will be the focus for our time together today in this session. So you're welcome to peruse on over to our website when you have some time to check out that framework, and in particular that intervention and instruction section. A couple of notes about how we'll interact within this session. We do have a chat feature, and we'll ask that you use the chat for comments. You can also message me, Jess Searles, privately if you have any questions or technology issues. I'll be monitoring the chat box. And also just note that the default to that chat box is to panelists, but you can change it to send your message to panelists and attendees as well, so we can all kind of see that stream of conversation in that chat box. So just know that it's going to default to panelists, and if it's something you want to share with the broader audience, click on that little blue rectangular oval to change it to the panelists and attendees so we can all see the information that you're sharing. And then for questions and answers in this session, using that question and answer feature, and we'll be able to kind of track through your questions and get those answered as we go through the session today. And it looks like Lauren has joined us, so I'm going to turn it over to her. Lauren, do you want me to keep my screen up, or do you have slides available?
If you're able to keep the screen up, that would be great.
Yeah, perfect.
So great, thank you everybody. And again, we apologize. In today's technology world, everything was working fine right before the very beginning, and then we had a technology glitch. But we're very glad to get up and running, and really glad to see everybody on. So on the next slide, we'll start by talking through a bit some kind of general principles around supporting children's reading and literacy skills as they relate to meaning level instruction. And because of the time, this is a very broad topic that we could do a whole series, of web events on. But, we obviously have the time together today. So what we really wanted to do in this session is just show you like where to access some additional resources and where to find that information for reference after the webinar. So we'll kind of, talk a bit about the principles, but also look at the different resources as well. We'll try to get as many as we can in the chat, but there is a packet of resources and a packet of all of the links that we're going to talk through today that were sent out, and they're also posted to the website as well. So you'll definitely have access to them if you didn't get them before the web event to look at them after. But we wanted to start by talking about some critical components related to children's reading comprehension to just kind of level set on where the discussion is today. And we know that for children to be successful readers, they need to be able to decode words on a page of text. So understand what the sounds of letters make and how they make words and recognize the words that are on a page of text. And that's really around the word recognition part. But we may also find that there are readers that seem to be able to recognize words on a page, but then when they're probed on their comprehension, there's some breakdowns. And that's because language comprehension is another critical component where you need to understand the words that you're decoding, what they mean, how the words make sentences, and how the passage is working. So for instance, you need to understand when there's pivots in a text, or if there's, what the words of grammatical cohesion are showing. And so that's really where that language piece comes in. So last week, exactly a week ago at this time, Jess led us through a session where we talked about word recognition and really kind of dove into that component. And this week, we're really going to look at that language comprehension piece. And as Jess was saying earlier in the beginning of the session, this is all related to a whole series. And so there were other sessions in the series before this that really dove into assessments, because we know that instruction and assessment are very closely related, and we want to use our assessment information and data to inform our instruction. So if you go to the next slide and just kind of click through it so everybody sees all the boxes, this just shows more specifically what the different components of word recognition and language comprehension are. So we're going to focus today on academic language skills and really talk about strategies and techniques and where to find resources to inform your work around supporting children in their inferential and literal comprehension skills, their academic language and vocabulary. The next slide shows these just situated within the 5 components of reading that were put forth by the National Reading Panel and continue to really be used in learning and instruction. So again, last week was really focused on the decoding aspect that you see in the boxes on the top around, like, for instance, supporting children in their phonemic awareness, their phonics. Today, we will talk more specifically about vocabulary and comprehension. All of this flows through what we call, or what everyone knows as tiered systems of support. So in your context, you might see response to intervention, or many entities are using multi-tiered systems of support now. So we can take these evidence-based practices that support children in their code-based and meaning level literacy skills, and that flows through tiered instructional systems where children will receive core instruction, and there will be assessments and screening to really understand how core instruction is meeting the children's needs. And for students that may be struggling, they can receive benefit from a targeted tier 2 intervention that's focused on the area that they would benefit from additional support. And then we would use progress monitoring and other assessment information to see how they're responding to intervention and if the intervention is meeting their needs. And if not, then there's some intervention intensification strategies that teachers can utilize to continue to support children in their intervention. So because of this, we call this multi-tier systems of support for reading. We also recognize that a lot of entities are using an integrated MTSS model, and that also targets behavior and socio-emotional supports. And that's really important. We'll focus today on reading, but just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how this goes through a tiered system. So what does this mean for school literacy leaders? So leaders have a role in leading out the implementation, supporting teaming structures in their school to lead out implementation of MTSSR and the MTSSR structures. And so in light of looking at evidence-based practices for reading and literacy, within a tiered instructional model, such as MTSS, the Lead for Literacy Center has developed a framework to support leaders in this endeavor. So there's 5 elements and 28 topics in the framework. And there you can see there's elements related to standards, priorities, and goals, administration, organization, communication. So we're really focused on today the instruction and intervention piece, and we'll be talking about the meaning level skills in that. But we basically, through the series, kind of targeted each different area of the framework. So definitely, if you're interested in finding out more related to assessments, the sessions are up on NAESP's website. And to support leaders in this framework that's meant to help implementation, and this just shows another kind of visual of the framework so that you can see that the framework elements are really situated within the circle of professional learning, because all of these will inform the school's professional learning, and that assessment and instruction are very interrelated and connected, even though today's session is really focused on instruction and assessment. And we also say that using a continuous improvement process is really important with this. So a school team, a leadership team might come together and look at the framework and decide where, the team, based on the data and the needs of the school, might want to set some actionables. And then you would use kind of this continuous improvement process where you evaluate, prioritize, action plan, kind of like a plan, do, study, act cycle to continuously, use the continuous improvement approach. And if you're wondering about where to find out more information about this framework, we also have indicators of success to help guide school leaders through the framework. That is our website, and we'll get that in the chat in a minute. And then there's a tool that goes with it too that we call the Navigator. So you can see on the Navigator that there's an element and the topics, and then basically there's like a way like school teams and people that you work with can rate the different levels of implementation related to the indicators of success. And so you can see then from the Navigator data, and this is just meant to be like an informal, an informal tool to help schools and sites around the continuous improvement approach with the Lead for Literacy framework. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that from the Navigator, school teams can ask themselves critical questions, such as what's your current strength and stretch? Where do you want to be in a year from now? And this will help informing that action plan as part of that cycle. So this was just a very kind of like horizontal view of kind of the overall framework. And now we're going to dive into that instruction piece and really talk about the meaning level literacy skills. So if we go to the next slide that says, this is similar to the other slide where we were looking at around the simple view of reading, and we're focusing today really on that language comprehension piece. So academic language skills include background knowledge, academic vocabularies, really supporting children in their inferential and literal and narrative language skills. So what we wanted to do today is to kind of show, before we get into the principles of academic language, show where we can find some resources that can be used for school teams to help. And what we wanted to do is show everybody some resources in the What Works Clearinghouse. But before that, we had a poll, and we just wanted to get some familiarity to see with everybody the level of familiarity you have with the What Works Clearinghouse material. Okay, great. Well, this is helpful. I see that a number of people are, have seen them used from time to time in their school. And some of you are noting that it's the first time you're hearing about it. So what we wanted to do is just kind of give a really brief tour of where to find some key resources in that site. So I don't know if it's possible just to click on the first link. Here, I could try to share my screen. Great. Okay, so this is the What Works Clearinghouse website. And if you go down to practice guides that are on a variety of topics, and they're basically the What Works Clearinghouse convened a panel of researchers and experts and stakeholders to really synthesize the research base and come out for each of the practice guides with some key recommendations. And each practice guide, there's some variation in feature across them, but they basically have, you know, about 4 to 6 recommendations on the topic. And then they'll have, yeah, that's great. If you can click on the foundational reading skills one, and you can see that there's the 4 recommendations, they'll have the steps on how to carry out the recommendations. They'll also talk about kind of possible roadblocks and solutions for the roadblocks. And then they have artifacts related to the practice guide as well. So they'll have example lessons and things like that. If you click on additional resources, great, and go down. So there's also a lot of additional resources that go with the practice guides. So we just clicked on the additional resources for this one. At the top, there are some new infographics that came out around evidence-based like how to consider the recommendations in a remote learning situation. Next to it, there is a whole site related to supporting your child's reading at home. And this includes, again, guides and resources and videos that show different techniques and ways to support children's academic language, shared book reading, extended conversations in the home. And so we just wanted to kind of show you where to find those resources. And then if you go down to the professional learning community guide, if you scroll down, great, yeah, I could click on that. This is a guide for the professional learning community. And what it is it basically, it's a guide that PLCs can use, or if you're doing professional development, you want to facilitate like professional development, this is a guide that aligns to the practice guide. And they have all these videos that really show the recommendations in practice. And we'll see a couple today, but a lot of these guides come with this professional learning facilitators guide and then has these associated videos. So in the materials, the links are all in the materials. And then I see in the chat that Jess had put in the What Works Clearinghouse guide. So this was just a little tour of the kind of What Works Clearinghouse site and where to find some of these resources on that slide. And so we're going to focus today on 3 of the practice guides. And the first one is the foundational skills to support reading. So on the next slide, you can see the 4 recommendations that are in that guide that we just talked through. So last week, Jess really focused on the areas of the guide that were focused on code-based skills. And today we're going to talk about the academic language piece of it. So that's recommendation 1. And so the guide really talks about explicitly engaging students in developing their narrative language skills, such as supporting their skills around hypothesizing, predicting, really supporting children around their words of grammatical cohesion, such as the connectives. There's a video, a really good video in there in the videos that just showed that really talks about the connectives, the importance of connectives, and in text, and how teachers can, some strategies to support students in the words of grammatical cohesion. Engaging students in conversations to support their use of language and the academic vocabulary. So we're going to talk a little bit about the vocabulary strategy. And on the next slide, there's an example of, a way that teachers can explicitly teach academic vocabulary. So this comes from a program called Excel from AIR, and it shows an example picture of soccer, and the word is anticipate. So in here, the children would see the picture and they would see the word anticipate. There's also some infusion of supports that help students who are, bilingual learners, for instance, in this routine. And so what the teacher would do is they would basically introduce the word and then explain how the picture shows the word. They would provide a child-friendly definition of the word, like anticipate means to expect and prepare for something. They might also provide a definition of the word also in the children's other languages too. There's, for children who are bilingual, sometimes some of the words are what we call cognates. So they are words from two different languages that mean something similar, and they sound alike and look alike. And this is really helpful because acquiring cognates are, it really helps children to see when words are cognates. So that's where you see that there's some explanation about words that are cognates. The other important piece in this routine is that in addition to the child-friendly definition and the visual, that the teacher provides a model for how the word is used in the sentence. So in here, the goalkeeper anticipates where the ball will go. That shows children where the word is in the sentence and how it looks in a sentence. And then this was a pre-reading exercise. So the teacher explained where children can find the word in the story. So in the story, the people who work for the National Park Service anticipate or expect many people will come to the concert. That was part of the text that the class was reading. And then the teacher provides opportunities for students to engage with each other through like peer-mediated support activity about the word. So they'll turn to each other and the teacher asks, tell your partner about a time when you anticipated you would have a good time and you did. Also part of this routine, you might provide examples and non-examples of the word as well. So this just shows kind of some of the recommendations from the practice guide and how to implement the recommendations in practice. And we have a video. I'm not sure if we're able to get the video. So the video that shows kind of a routine similar to this begins at 2:45. And as you're watching it, I just want you to note kind of if your name comes at the first half of the alphabet, so it's A through L, if you can note kind of like watch the video for the teacher and note what steps the teacher took in the video to support the student learning and what materials the teacher was using. And then if your name comes from at the end of the alphabet, if you can look at the video from the perspective of the students, and you would want to note in there, how feedback was provided to the students, how the students seemed with their level of engagement. And we'll all look at the video and think about how this routine might be able to look on a virtual space.
Question. Nice job. Turn the page. Ooh. Okay, we're on to our last word. Our last word is hardly. What's the word?
Hardly.
Emmanuel, what's the word? Hardly. I have a picture for you. Hardly means not very much. I hardly do that. Or I hardly go to visit that place. In this picture, some light bulbs use a lot of energy. Some bulbs use hardly any energy. So hardly means just a little bit. Okay? So maybe there was something you used to do all the time when you were little. And now maybe you hardly do that thing anymore. Can you try to think about something you used to do a lot when you were in kindergarten, first grade, preschool, and now you hardly do it. You don't do it very much. Give me a thumbs up once you've had enough time to think about it. Jonathan, can you use a sentence for me? I hardly.
So I hardly ever use my roller skates anymore because I used to use them a lot because when I got them I was super excited and I used them for 2 months straight. But when we moved, it got really complicated to use them anymore because we hardly had any wood floor.
I want us to.
Great. Okay. If you're able to unmute and want to talk about what you kind of noticed in the routine from the teacher's perspective or the students, we can, or if you want to put it in the chat, we can do that as well, and I'll kind of monitor the chat. So again, what were your impressions related to what steps the teacher took to ensure the student learning, how the students seemed in their level of engagement, and any ideas you may have about how this could look in a virtual space. We'll just give a minute for everyone to note some ideas down. Great. So I see in the chat that it was noted that facial expressions are used, hand gestures, showing what the word looks like, that is used as well. And yeah, so there was also visuals a child-friendly definition that the teacher provided for the word. And if you notice too on that, this is a great kind of screenshot of it, the teacher also put the pictures up on the wall. So that's the other thing too, and how some words can be reinforced, is using word walls and things like that. I also see someone wrote students' choral response, allowing for individual responses, giving multiple explanations, making personal connections. Great. So the other thing that comes through that the practice guides talk about is the nature of supporting children, not only in this explicit instruction of vocabulary of high utility vocabulary words, but also supporting students in becoming better independent word learners. And so this is another practice guide. And again, you have all the links in the materials. And this is the practice guide around teaching teaching literacy in academic content areas. It's geared, it looks at the research related to English language learners, but a lot of what they talk about is really just good, practices around like vocabulary and things like that. So they talk about strategies to promote vocabulary learning as, for instance, providing students information around context clues and showing them strategies and having them engage in strategies and have learning opportunities related to strategies around finding unknown words by using the context. They also talk about the strategy of using morphology techniques around, word parts. So giving students learning opportunities, games, and instruction around how to decipher words from looking at word parts. Word reference skills is another strategy that tends to come up in some of the research, and that's helping students hone in on dictionary skills, things like that. And then for English learners or children who are bilingual, supporting them in really recognizing words that are cognates, because that's really helpful for students to be able to recognize when a word, like we just saw with anticipate, it looks alike, sounds alike, and means the same thing across two languages. The next slide just shows an example of an activity for morphology. We won't show the video, but can pop the link in. And this is, again, was just part of the video, all the videos that we showed at the beginning of this session. And some of the videos will show the classroom, like the teacher implementing one of the recommendations in the classroom like we just saw. Other videos will actually show different activities that can be done. So this is one video that shows this kind of card sorting activity that can be done in the classroom, and then using different charts to kind of note morphology. So I just wanted to mention that. So vocabulary is a really important piece, but we also know that supporting children around their academic language skills is important as well. And so we'll move on and talk a little bit about important principles around comprehension strategies. And for this comes from the Improving Reading Comprehension in Kindergarten through Third Grade Practice Guide. And again, we'll focus on recommendation 1, although many of these recommendations really support children around this. So the research talks about teaching students how to use reading comprehension strategies around, it's kind of 7, activating prior knowledge, questioning, visualizing, monitoring, clarifying, teaching reading comprehension strategies individually or in combination. And they kind of talk about different ways teachers can teach strategy instruction. So they talk about, for instance, the transactional strategy approach and other ways that strategies can be taught. And utilizing a gradual release approach for teaching strategies, where the teacher will model and give examples and explain, and then give opportunities for the teacher and the students to work together on the strategy, and then it kind of gradually releases responsibility in the learning to the students. So if you go to the next slide, I think we have, and so this just explains it. And then the slide after shows the gradual release model. And I want to note that it's page 15 of that practice guide that talks about strategies related to gradual release. So this was just a figure from the guide, so we wouldn't have to go back and forth between the internet and PowerPoint. But on the other side of the guide, it actually talks about different language that teachers can use with each of the tasks noted in here. So gradual release, the teacher would show the comprehension strategy give a description of the strategy, model it, work it through with the students. Maybe students would have an opportunity to do the strategy with each other, you know, in peers, and then it slowly shifts to like the independent use of the strategy. So we have one more video to show. And again, we'll look at the video in the same way. And I should say that these prompts actually come from the Professional Learning Community Guide that Jess showed earlier in the session. And so if you looked at the video last time from the perspective of the teacher, if you can look at the video from the perspective of the student, and we'll just kind of switch them. And so the reading comprehension one comes in at 4 minutes in the video.
I want to remind you of what our focus is today. Today we are really going to determine that story structure. Take just a minute to look at our different parts of story structure to remind us of the parts that we're going to be looking for today. Belinda, what is something you notice that's part of story structure that we're going to work on today?
The beginning, middle, and the end.
The beginning, the middle, and the end. And what do we call that, Cece, when it's the beginning, the middle, and the end?
A plot.
The plot of the story. Morales, what else are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at the plot. What else are we going to be looking at today?
The characters.
The characters. Who's in the story. And Chris, what else are we going to be working on?
Setting.
Setting. Ooh. What is setting, Abigail?
Outside or inside.
Okay, yeah, where the story takes place. So we're going to focus on where the story takes place, or setting, the characters in our story, and we're going to look at just one of the chapters from Judy Moody and determine what happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Okay, well, we're pulling the PowerPoint back up. If anyone wants to note kind of some key takeaways from, you know, how you've noticed that the teacher, you know, what the teacher did to ensure the student learning, what materials were used, any additions you may have as ideas for the routine, and how this might work virtually.
Practice math on Adapted Mind.
You see someone wrote setting a purpose for the upcoming activity. They used a graphic organizer, so the practice guide talks about graphic organizer. One thing that that also is kind of talked about in, for instance, the literacy instruction, the content areas practice guide, is using sentence frames to support student in their academic language. So that was one thing too that I thought could be a good scaffold, is maybe putting in some sentence frames into the graphic organizer. And that helps children structure their kind of thinking in terms of their academic, you know, academic language. And really you could actually infuse in some of the key vocabulary words that you want children to engage in the sentence frames. We also found just in some other work that when you're giving sentence frames to students, using connectives like the because, moreover, therefore, helps children really see how the connectives fit in, and also helps them extend their thinking. So great. So I see in the chat, people are writing, she gave affirmations when students were correct, used the anchor chart, really explicitly showed students what to expect. So all of these elements that we've talked about related to the recommendations in the practice guides and the videos really include this notion of explicit, systematic, and strategy instruction. And so explicit instruction is just really clearly stating in detail, you know, what you're modeling, what the learning opportunity is. Systematic is using carefully planned sequence. So, you know, you might model a strategy in the beginning and then give children, you know, peer-to-peer learning opportunities and some scaffolds, and then maybe give them some opportunities for their independent use of the strategy. And then strategy instruction is showing how to approach something. So the next couple of slides just show kind of some of the features of each. So we'll just quickly kind of note them again, that the features of explicit instruction is modeling, providing explanation, providing checks for understanding. And Jess really went into detail last week about, you know, explicit instruction and how you might provide checks for understanding, error corrections, appropriate lesson pacing. Some features of systematic instruction is really related to presenting the lesson in a way where concepts build on top of each other, breaking complex skills down into smaller, more manageable chunks. So that video, the morphology activity, really does a nice job of that. So if you're interested in kind of looking at that, those videos show with some of this academic language pieces like connectives and morphology, how you might be able to break these complex skills down. Scaffolding instruction. And then strategy instruction really just relates to like naming the strategy, explaining when to apply it, modeling its use, guiding the students in the use of it, using gradual release. So we're going to turn it over in a minute and talk about intensive intervention and walkthrough. But first, we wanted to do a quick poll about the components that are discussed in this section. What might you like to explore more with your school team?
Okay, the poll is launched. Folks will go ahead and fill that out. We'll end in just a minute.
Great. If you want to close the poll, we'll take a look. Great. So it looks like from the poll that many are talking about looking at explicit and systematic instruction more and looking at explicit vocabulary instruction. I see in the chat that you can't choose all that apply. And so it looks like everyone kind of chose their main one. But if there's others that you would really like to also focus on and want to put them in the chat, that's great. And again, the practice guides really give a lot of information, and there's actually a video that shows different vocabulary routines that can be used as well. So I do want to give us enough time to talk about intensive intervention. So we'll just briefly go through and let you know about some additional materials. So up on the site, you have informational resources around vocabulary and reading comprehension from the Meadows Center and the National Center on Improving Literacy. There's also, on your next slide, there's the Florida Center for Reading Research has a bunch of activities that can be used for literacy at like all the levels and grades, in grades K through 3, and so that's the link there. And then this is just, we didn't get a lot into constructing sentence stems, but Project Elite, this is a bookmark that comes from, this is a model demonstration project that's funded from the Office of Special Education Programs. And so again, they have a lot of resources as well. And I should say that we're not endorsing any resource or center, but we do want to disseminate what is out there and what's been developed. And then there's a couple of distance learning resources as well. So we'll just jot the link up. And if you go to the implementation data piece, we did just want to make a brief mention about using implementation data and again, put in some of the links. There's some good walkthrough tools that have been recently developed from the Regional Education Lab and Boise State that really, again, there's areas of the walkthrough tool that really focus on vocabulary and reading comprehension. And so, and that collecting implementation data, I noticed that there was this article in NAESP that really talks about when you're collecting implementation data, it's really helpful. And I think there's a quote in the article that says, because it drives a cycle of continuous improvement by focusing on the effects of instruction. And so we do want to give a little bit of time for intensive intervention, so we can kind of move to that section, but just put the link to the REL walkthrough tool. And I should say that it links in a coaching routine with the walkthrough tool and also an action planning piece. And I'll turn it over to Jess for intensive intervention.
All right, we'll go through intensive intervention really quickly, so hang on tight because we will wrap up really quickly with some intervention intensity. Know that the session from last week that is up on NAESP's website has a little bit more depth to this than we'll go into today. But as we're looking at increasing intervention, and most of the time early intervention for K2 will be focused on code-based skills, but there are times that you may provide some additional interventions and intensity around vocabulary and comprehension too, and that oral language development and academic language. So as you're looking at intervention and increasing intervention across tiers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and these two students, 1 and 2, are kind of the focus of this graphic. So you can see as they're going in their tier 1, they're part of a pretty large group, but they are still parts of that tier 1 instruction. So we're not pulling students out of their tier 1 time to get their intervention. It's in addition to their tier 1 time. So as we're looking at vocabulary and comprehension specifically, students would get vocabulary and comprehension in their tier 1 reading group time. And then in tier 2, there would be some more explicit, more systematic instruction around vocabulary and comprehension. So there may be additional sentence starters or using some of those connective that Lauren was talking about, or really diving into some vocabulary and that oral language development for academic vocabulary in tier 2 and tier 3. In addition to, you may be working on code-based skills in those tier 2 and tier 3 groups too. So really gauging the needs of your students and then adjusting that instruction across intensification accordingly. What does more intensity mean? I know I saw on the poll we wanted more information on explicit and systematic instruction. When we're talking about intensity, it does mean more explicit instruction. We're modeling more. We're having students practice more. We're checking for understanding more frequently. We are giving explanations for what students do, just quick, straight learning targets so students know exactly the learning targets within their tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 instruction. So really making that really direct for students. And then more monitoring and more feedback. If students are practicing more, we're also giving them more feedback because they're getting more practice for us to provide that feedback for. So really looking at time, data, all intensifying across those tiers of support for students. And then we do have a couple slides in here about intervention considerations when we're talking about tier 2 and tier 3 curriculum. What are some curriculum decisions that we need to make around tier 2 and tier 3 curriculum? And then in addition, what are some of those evidence-based practices to use there as well? How do we know where to start? Before we really start intensifying instruction for any students, we're going to make sure that whatever curriculum they've been part of has been implemented for a sufficient amount of time. And then we'll be collecting data, considering areas to intensify, developing plans for implementation, and then implementing the plan. So not only talking about a plan, but actually doing the plan and collecting data as that plan is running, and then using that data to, again, determine more instructional adjustments if needed. So really looking at the tie between data and instructional decision making. They're intertwined. I'm not delivering instruction without collecting some form of data, and I'm not collecting data without it informing my instruction. Either that I need to keep things the same because they're working, or I need to make some adjustments, and using that data to make those adjustments. So then you have here, this is from the NCII, so National Center on Intensive Intervention, and they do have a structure on their website around informing instructional adjustments based on data. So you'll see there's progress monitoring there, there's some diagnostic data there, so collecting different forms of data to really inform instruction as we intensify across tiers. What areas can we intensify? Again, this is from the NCII resource on their website, Taxonomy of Intervention, and it talks about seven different dimensions that we can look at intensifying that could be applied to foundational skills or vocabulary and comprehension, depending on where that intensification needs to happen for students. And then a few questions to consider. So looking at, as we're thinking about intensification for students, is the intervention that we're providing actually matching the students' needs? Can the intervention be integrated into other areas of academic instruction? So just some questions to kind of consider as we're thinking about intensification and how we can really support students in that process. And then there are guides on NCII's website as well to think through the planning and the implementation process. And you'll see they'll have columns about adaptations that are being provided, and that's, again, based on data. How can we adapt that instruction to better meet the needs of students as we're gathering that data? And then these are intensive intervention resources that you'll have access to as well, and links there in that website. And then Lauren, I'll turn it back over to you to poll 3.
Okay, great. Why don't we do the poll for a minute? We have about a minute left. And looking at intensive intervention, what areas are you looking at exploring with your school team? So around implementing tier 2 reading intervention, collecting data, strategies for intensifying, or looking more closely at that taxonomy that Jess talked about. Okay, great. You can close the poll. Yeah, that's what I thought. There's a lot of interest in strategies for intensifying intervention. So we put the link to NCII, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which has a ton of tools around ways to support data teams. They have a literacy series as well. And so, great, well, we'll wrap up, and we wanted to put the evaluation link on the screen while we kind of wrap up. We just wanted to overview, again, the continuous improvement process, the Lead for Literacy framework, and let you know too, again, this is part of a series. So there were 2 sessions, one in November and January, where we really dove really deeply into assessments and talked about screening, progress monitoring, and considerations for database decision making. We also had another session that overviews the framework more. These sessions were focused on instruction, and we have a session coming up in June that focuses on the professional learning systems. So if you have a chance to take the survey, that would be great. It definitely really helps us. And again, thank you to everybody for attending and engaging in this session, and to Jess for jumping in as well. And Gracie and Honor, thank you so much to NASP for having us, and to everybody for bearing with the tech glitches from the beginning.
You know, we
have a question. Oh, go ahead, Gracie. Yeah.
Yes,
I'll put that in the
question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put that in the I'll put it in the Q&A. Yeah, about the videos. So I'll drop that link in there right before we close out the webinar. So let me pull that up real quick.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, audience, for being so patient today. When that teacher talked about beginning, middle, and end, that was one of my favorite things to teach with my kindergarten and my transition kids. Loved it, loved it. So brought back a lot of good memories for me. But you always share such great information, links to great resources. So again, we appreciate you being here with us today and look forward to seeing you again in June.